pride comes before the fall, yes, but pride is also the last great self-offering that we make to transcend the ego. Good morning and welcome to Sunday service. You know there are two kinds of people, of course. You know that. There's them that obey the law and there's them that don't. And so here we're going to talk about the law. You know, there's a charming story. I've always, it's always stuck with me. And it's a story of Krishna and oh, come on, what's her name? What's the Pandava's wife's name? Draupadi, thank you. And so she says to the Lord, the Lord says to her, Draupadi, you should practice yoga, you should meditate. And she looks at him and she says, but Lord, how can I practice yoga? My mind is always centered on you. And then it says Krishna just smiled. Now, that degree of mindfulness, as we might call it today, is not so easy to accomplish. And it's too easy to think, as we do when we split things, it's really both and, right? When we split things, we think, well, I should just obey. I remember somebody who when I made the statement, as I have sometimes, in describing how we're organized and how Swami Kriyananda has created Ananda, I would say, you know, we're here to practice discipleship because our Guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, is not here personally in the body to correct us and guide us. That is the normal image or understanding of what it means to have a Guru. That's not really the big picture, but that's how people imagine it in their simplest terms. But this particular person was not very happy with that idea. Either the person didn't want to practice discipleship, which is what I suspected, or possibly wanted to be the Guru instead, or maybe just wanted to have a Guru in the body. But it's not that simple. You know the beautiful story in Jesus' life when there's a crowd of people. You know, at some point in his ministry, in the early part, it seemed like he was doing miracles left and right. That's probably an exaggeration, right? But anyway, he was doing all these miracles, and thousands of people, especially in the Galilee, were following him all over the place. That's when he, you know, did the bread and the fish and the loaves and all those kinds of things. Well, it's a beautiful story. There he is, and just crowded with all these people wanting to be healed and to be with him and so forth. And he's trying to walk through this crowd as I imagine it, and then he stops and he says, power hath gone out of me. And Peter and some of the other disciples were they were like bodyguards, right? You can just see the scene, sort of like a celebrity or something. What's her name? Taylor Swift or Swift Taylor or something? Anyway, one of those kind of people, or in my day it was, you know, the Beatles or something. Anyway, so you can just imagine the scene. And Peter looks at Jesus and says, I mean, in my words, what are you talking about? There's a million people all over the place. Of course someone touched you. And so he made a big scene about it. Jesus did. They don't put it all in words, but it's obvious because the woman who was immediately healed, it says of a hemorrhage, whatever that is. I'm sure it wasn't hemorrhoids, but maybe it was. Anyway, just want to make sure you're here with me, okay? But whatever it was, he made a big deal. He sort of embarrassed her, is what he did. And she was just sort of shaking like a leaf, you know, to have been spotlighted like that. But yeah, there were all these people, you know, give me, give me, give me. I want, I want, I want. And then he turned to her and he said, woman, thy faith has healed thee. And so when we talk about, and in our simplistic way of thinking, we think of the law and we think of love, that's That's maybe our simplistic thinking, because her faith is the law. Her love is the law. The law is perfected in love because, well, there's a story of Mozart, for example. I tried to look it up, but I just couldn't find it. Even with ChatGPT, I couldn't find the story. And so Mozart was asked by somebody, some younger composer, I imagine, how to compose a symphony and all this. And so Mozart says, well, you got to do this, you got to do that. All right. And then the guy says, but you composed a symphony or whatever he did at age 5. And Mozart looks at him and says, yeah, but I didn't have to ask. And what I mean by this is that most of us do need to comply with the law of health, for example, eating right, the law of relationships, being respectful and courteous, all the things that, one needs to do to be successful. And what does successful mean? It's the goal you seek, so it makes you happy when you're successful. You should be successful. And even if not attached to it, even if not desiring it, go figure that out some other time. In any case, what I'm saying is this is a natural progression, the bifurcation that we think of. See, where I see is not really real. I see, well, there's another story. Yogananda was, I always forget the details, but anyway. So he met somebody, a very sincere devotee. And Yogananda asked the person, well, have you had a spiritual experience? Have you found God? Have you had, I don't know, a vision of Jesus or something? And the man said, no. And he said, well, why don't you practice Kriya Yoga? And the man hesitated about that. He didn't know quite about that. He was a bhakti. He was devotional. Right, bhakti? Yeah. But he didn't think, and this is what I see in what we do here with teaching techniques and so forth. Those who go by inspiration, by feeling, sometimes, not all of them, but sometimes they just get bored with or are frustrated with or resistant to, the 5-finger exercises of breath techniques and different things like that. And I appreciate that. You just want to rise to the top. But like this man who finally conceded and practiced the technique, he had a vision of Divine Mother or whatever he had a vision of. You see, it really is a both and. And when our mind, however, we have to work responsibly with our mind as well. There are times when I just don't feel like doing techniques. I'm inspired. I sit down and maybe I chant, maybe I don't chant, but I'm just there. The whole purpose of the techniques is to bring you there. But is it that way every day? No. Have I found incredible experiences and depth of inspiration and so forth by the power, the grace that flows through the techniques, especially given by a God-realized master? Yes, you see, it's both. And yet you do need to, not need to, but it's appropriate to work with your energy, your consciousness, your heart, your mind, in the way that is authentic to you. It's just that if you do too much of one or the other, you're going to lose both. If you're too much into techniques, maybe you're German. Just want to see if you're here. If you're too much into willpower, in other words, then it becomes dry. It becomes boring, all right? And you don't find the satisfaction. If, on the other hand, you're too Italian, and you're only into feeling, into emotion, there are other kinds of emotions. And so you hit rock bottom with all sorts of things: anger, despair, self-doubt, etc., despondency, all those things. You become a victim of those emotions. And so it's really the both and of the training to do the work that's needed to achieve success. And yet not to mistake the path for the goal. The path isn't to huff and puff until you reach salvation. You're to huff and puff until you don't need to huff and puff, until you achieve the breathless state, you see. So the dichotomy proposed to us, essentially in this reading, is actually a false dichotomy. Yet it's too often how we think. We think we don't need techniques, or maybe we think that we don't see maybe other people, because I've lived in community most of my life and a lot of group meditations more than otherwise would be the case. You see all sorts of people and, they sit up and they have the perfect lotus pose and they're meditating for long periods of time and, they're the perfect yogi. And what does that develop? Pride. Why? Pride it comes before the fall, yes, but pride is also the last great self-offering that we make to transcend the ego. And in fact, one of the downsides of the path of meditation, the inner path generally, is the fact that as we take the energy of our life vitality, known as prana or chi, whatever, and as we move it inward and lift it and offer it up, it has to go through this point, the seat of ego. And it's in fact, not most, I don't know about most, but many of the stories that come to us from India, the mother of yoga, have to do with those who sought the powers that come with the raising of the energy within. Saints in East and West, it's not just about India or yogis, but levitation, telepathy, clairvoyance, all those things that are talked about in the Yoga Sutras are exhibited by people as they grow spiritually. It's just what comes. But it's a trap, because as the energy rises, it energizes the ego. And so the obvious antidote to that is yajna, is self-offering, is devotion, you see. Too much willpower enables the ego. And this may sound like a segue here, but maybe it is a segue, if it sounds like one. But I don't know about you, but how many of you run into people who you hear them say, maybe to you personally, or they say it on the radio or something, have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? If not, you're going to go to hell. Well, as Yogananda said to somebody who said that to him, he said, well, I may get there by and by, but my friend, you're there already. And with that judgment and condemnation. And so growing up in a milieu, in a culture where that kind of, thing would be stated too often, I, from myself personally at least, have always recoiled to a certain extent with that image. First off, my personal savior is what, like a butler or something? Come on, let's go. And even when people in the yoga movement use the phrase my guru, well, it's innocent enough, but what is it, like a toy or something that you have in your pocket? You see, we just get off base so easily. And yet, for all the concepts, all the precepts, all the techniques and practices, it's all personal. It's like you can't achieve the impersonal state without achieving personal purification and transcendence. You have to go through. Part of the technique of listening to the inner sounds, especially the Om, and to achieve a union, a communion with the creation, symbolizes, it's an actual thing, but it symbolizes that we have to work out our karma. As Yogananda put it once, how can you achieve the love of God if everybody in the world hates your guts? Basically, It has been said, I don't know that it's true, and I kind of hope it isn't, but anyway, it has been said that you have to achieve one perfect relationship before you can, get a ticket to ride? I can see what age you are by whether you get it. Okay. Anyway, it all becomes personal. And I quoted in the prayer, I love that. There are so many slokas from the Gita that I just love, but the one where Krishna promises to make good my deficiencies and render permanent my gains, I'm hanging on to that one. You know, you've maybe heard that story, and guess what? I'm not going to tell it. The story of the carrot. Haven't you told the story of the carrot where the grumpy, selfish woman rises to heaven on the carrot? It's a stupid story, actually. I don't believe it. But
why does she rise to heaven on the carrot? Why?
Why did she what?
Rise to heaven on the carrot.
Because she finally, after a life of complete selfishness, had one very imperfect, but one halfway thoughtful thought. And so with that one little thought, she was rising to heaven. I'm not going to tell the story. But it does become personal. The power of God incarnate in human form reflects back to us that our human form has the potential for divinity. That's the message, that's the promise of immortality. You know, it's astounding to me, some of the things I hear said in Christianity. The whole thing of, imagine dying, being stuck in a coffin, going underground, and then sometime 1 billion years later, you're going to come out of the coffin with the resurrection of the dead? You're kidding. I mean, the things that get distorted, I mean, it's not that there aren't truth in these things. It's just, what does it really mean, okay? To resurrect, I mean, we're not a body anyway. We're a soul made in the image of God. And so the resurrection of the soul is the awakening of the soul in God. And it's eternal. The body may be in a casket, but that's just not it's missing the point, as Patanjali says with a guffaw. And so our real salvation, in other words, the Christians aren't wrong. Without a personal Savior, you're not going to make it. Oh, you might be a good person, you might get a nice birth next time, or maybe even if you're really virtuous, you can be successful and make a lot of money, as some of the televangelists will tell you. Fine, but it's just not the end of the game. Until you can internalize that relationship as who you are. It's just, you know, you can overcome this thing here and then you've got that thing over there. It just never ends that way. You know, I go through these different phases of things like you do. And one of the things I've gone through here recently is tuning into the original anchorites, hermits, desert fathers, whatever the term is, in the earliest centuries of Christianity, before the church took over. You know, before Constantine made the church, or whatever it was, the state religion, which was the end of it. You know, let me finish that thought before I go to a new thought. And so I was struck that in reading the life of St. Anthony and St. Paul of the Desert and some of these incredible people who were extreme ascetics living in the desert, they had developed the natural inclination. I mean, have you ever gone on a fast or been just ravenously hungry? It's really hard to be polite, right, when you're hungry. And but these guys, you know, what would happen is they'd go out in the desert, they'd start to develop this incredible spiritual magnetism and have all these amazing experiences, and then people would hear about it. So, and then all these people would come and they'd say, I'm sick of this, and they'd go further out into the Egyptian desert or somewhere, and people kept following them. But I was struck just how sweet it was that among them, their whenever people would come, they would simply stop what they were doing. If they were fasting for a couple of days, they would feed people, and they were always courteous and polite. I mean, that sounds nice for us who have homes and all these things. But when you're out in the desert and it's, every day is a day of survival, you don't stand on courtesy or whatever it is you stand on. It's pretty bare bones. And yet they had that refinement of consciousness. The guest is God, as we hear, as it's said in India. But what we've inherited in our culture is something Swamiji talks about in some of the more developed readings from which this reading, our weekly readings, come. And it's worth noting because we have a cultural tendency, an inheritance, if you will. And all the stories of, let's say, the Bible and all these scriptures, when they're stories and parables, are always metaphors for the inner path. Moses leading the Israelites from captivity. Moses represents the ego, not in a bad way, meaning our conscious efforts. And to lead us out of addiction, lead us out of delusion, lead us out of bad habits, whatever it might be, is we need that willpower. That's the willpower part of things. And then in the history of the poor Israelites, everyone beats them up, but I guess they deserved it. As they said of themselves, they're stubborn people. But as Yogananda said about his disciples, I attract stubborn people. And what he meant by that is that takes willpower to be a devotee, not being weak and, Jesus meek and mild. I don't know where they come up with that, but he may have been meek and mild occasionally, but he was the other too. He had a tremendous amount of willpower. And I mean, after all, how many of you have fasted for 40 days, okay? So all the troubles they went through when they would disobey the law, in other words, God through Moses, the metaphor is, here are the laws of life. Okay, the laws of health, the law of relationship, the law of success. There are certain things. And so God, if you want to put it that way, gives us the laws by which we function in this world. The 10 Commandments, if you want to call it. All those things, whatever you want to call them. The yamas and niyamas of Patanjali, the 10 Commandments of Moses. It's all the same thing. Okay? So we're given those, but we can't even handle those. And so the poor Israelites, they disobey, and then they'd be kicked out and conquered, or something bad would happen. That's our story. And then because they got all these laws, and because they were a stubborn people, meaning like you and me, they clung to the law. And so poor Jesus comes along and wants to offer them the love, wants to show them the possibility of divinity in human form. And of course, not very many said yes, okay? And so that tendency to stick with the rules. So then what happens? Those people rejected him, other than a handful of crazy Christians. And then who takes over? The Romans. The great gift and genius of Roman civilization was the law. Okay? And we see that in the Acts of the Apostles, and St. Paul was a Roman citizen, therefore they couldn't crucify him, and he had to be sent to Rome to be put on trial. They had privileges back then. They had rules. And so what happens when the church becomes the state religion? Rules, the law. And so the Gnosticism of the Desert Fathers, the devotion, the seclusion, the inner experience. And when you read things like being immersed in water, touching the feet, a lot of the things that the Israelites were doing were all customs that were and are practiced in India. So that whole Eastern inner subjective aspect of the spiritual path was left behind. Sure, there were great saints in Christianity, of course, St. Francis, St. Teresa, and many, many others. But as a rule, as a culture, we're into the rules. We're into what it takes to be successful outwardly. And so it is that, and we've entered an age where it's all about me. Well, it is all about me. But the question is that's being offered to us is, who am I? That's the question, always has been the question. And so the power of divinity manifesting in human form is the grace that makes good our deficiencies and renders permanent our gains. And I've been realized many years ago, and sometimes when I do a meditation class, I've realized that the key to the spiritual path, yes, it's meditation, but it's really the moment to moment. When you read the lives of the saints, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa, all the saints east and west, but I've been recently tuning into these hermits in the desert. It's all, they had the hesychast movement. You see, the the Orthodox Church in the eastern part of the empire, which survived 1,000 years longer than the Roman Empire on the west, they retained the inner experience. And they came up with what they called the Jesus prayer. Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It doesn't work for me. As Master said, don't call yourself a sinner. It's the greatest sin there is, to call yourself a sinner. We're in a different age. But I was listening to a talk that he gave that someone took from a transcription. It's on the YouTube thing. Very sweet, very beautiful. Yogananda, Master, he used Door of My Heart. He was talking about the way to commune inwardly, moment to moment throughout the day. And he said, door of my heart, open wide, I keep for thee. Wilt thou come? Wilt thou come? Just for once, come to me. Night and day, I look for thee, night and day.
Love is all I know, sun rays on the snow of a winter long.